So, hi everybody. I'd like to welcome Robert Axtell from George Mason University. He does age-based modeling, which is kind of the fully comprehensive, extremely detailed model of how the world really works. And he's one of the world leaders, so he can hopefully tell us how close we are to the dream. So, welcome, Robert.
Thanks a lot. I really appreciate it, Greg. And I'm going to just go to full screen here on my slides. Hopefully, you guys can see that introductory slide. Is that okay?
Yes.
Good. Okay. So yeah, I'm just going to march through this. And is it, Greg, I have like 45 minutes to an hour. Is that the right
Yeah,
format?
that would be perfect.
Okay, good. Okay, so I'm just going to go through an example today of work at full scale with an economy, and this is work that we have a book coming out about this. So I'm going to present both the economic side of it as well as the computational side. So you guys should feel free to interrupt me at any time though to ask questions or whatever. Okay, and I'm going to give a little bit of background, but I'm going to assume that you guys have obviously a computing background, but also have some economics background. But I'm going to also try to just provide a little bit of background on some of the data and economic stuff for those of you guys who are not economists. Okay, so here's I guess the basic setup here is that in the social sciences, and I sit in computational social science at George Mason. We really do have kind of a different world than when I was a graduate student, for example. So, we have ways to get data that we didn't have, say, 30 years ago. For example, many of you will know about experimental methods where we can put people down in laboratory settings and get data that way. But there's also very large scale, data availability, from randomized field trials, from what my colleague from Santa Fe, Duncan Watts, has called digital exhaust, in which the big data companies, as you guys are key providers of. But what I'm going to talk today primarily about are going to be administrative data, where the data are in essence comprehensive. They have the data on every single entity in question. And so, but these sources of data were not available, before the year 2000, say. So we're 20 years into this revolution, and of course, computing makes it all possible. Right? Computing through, and I've just written here, networks, markets, firms, agents. We have very many different styles of computing these days, and I'm going to go through a way to use agent computing to build whole economy models. Okay, so this is the background here. Now, I think I'm not going to say much more about this today, but just I personally feel that, and I tell my students, the biggest challenge today really is, we're moving beyond simple models. We're moving into more complex computational ones. One thing that I think is a challenge, though, is to think that, by the year 2030, 2040, 2050, those people are going to have such better computing power than we have. What can we do today that's going to be of interest to somebody in 2050? They're going to view our computing power as modest or negligible by comparison to what they have, right? So anyways, as we go through this, I'll make some comments about that. Okay, so from the point of view of data, I've got here a picture of a tiger, and we normally think we understand the thing that we're looking at, that we're studying, and we just add little bits and pieces to it. We add a little bit of here and a little bit there, and we get a better picture of the tiger. I'm going to argue today that this is really what we face in the current environment. That is, we really have data from all these different sources. Data potentially on every individual thing, with the usual privacy concerns, and we don't really understand the basics. We don't understand what the heck picture we're trying to build from. So we have these different approaches to building models from data. Machine learning, in economics, we would commonly work with representative agents, and some of you will know, for example, in the big macro models that are used by policymakers like the Fed, they typically have one representative agent, not a large number of them. But today I'm going to talk about computational agents, how we can build up models of things when we have this, just gigantic amount of data. We don't really know what the overall picture, could be or should be. All right. So this is what I'm going to be talking about today is really material from our forthcoming book with my co-author Omar Guerrero, one of my students from George Mason, who's now at University College London, and the Turing Data Institute in London. And it's a book where we go through, as the title says, data theories and models. I'm going to talk today primarily about the data on American business firms and models thereof. I won't spend much time on the theories or the methodology part, but the idea is that we're providing also code for building the kind of models I'm going to describe today. We're going to have code there. You need to have a slightly specialized workstation to run these codes, but there are toy codes there that anybody can run at a smaller scale. Okay. So once again, thinking that many of you guys are not economists, I'm just going to give a quick overview of why we would want to study the private sector. So all of you guys are members of the private sector, or at least if those of you guys working at Alphabet, You work for a firm, you're employee of a firm, and we have various ways to understand what the heck a firm is. Many of the theories of the firm are they're not very quantitative, and so I'm going to try to provide to you guys a model today that's very quantitative, and it's based on the data that we have on all U.S. firms. Okay, I'm just going to assert now. You can query me about this later, but I'm just going to assert that today we do not have models that explain these data. I mean, we have micro data on every firm in America. We don't have models that explain those data. And once again, we can argue about that at the end, but I think I'm going to argue that basically the theories of Williamson and Coase and the things that various Nobel Prizes have been awarded for, Holmstrom, Hart, those are not models of individual firms. At least they're not useful as that. So the first thing I'm going to do is just describe what the data are, and then we can go ahead and build models from that. All right. And hopefully the answer to this last question is, can we build models? I'm going to show you guys a model today that explains much of the data. All right. So just once again, because you guys are not necessarily don't have a background on the specifics of the U.S. economy, this is now kind of the economy at 30,000 feet. I'm going to paint with a coarse brush here to say there's a giant pool of laborers, right? There's a giant pool of workers, and there's this set of firms, and of course we provide a work effort to the firms, and the firms give us wages. This is the normal bargain. Just now to make it quantitative, there are roughly 120 million people in the U.S. private sector. It was more than that before COVID. It's less than that now, but it's roughly 120 million people. There are another 30 million in the public sector. I'm not going to talk about that today. It turns out we don't know a lot about the public sector, just because we don't have a lot of data on it. We don't have comparable data. Basically, the data we have on the private sector is going to be based on tax records, and I'll get into that more in a minute here. Okay, there are 30 million firms, but in fact, most of them don't have employees. I mean, most of this, if I do some consulting job, over the course of this year, and then the on my tax forms, I file Schedule C. That puts me down as a firm for IRS purposes. I'm not really a firm with employees. So there are really 6 million firms with employees. So 6 million firms with employees, 120 million workers, average firm size is 20, right? Let's do the math in your head. Only 10,000 of these firms are the public ones. These are the big ones, 10,000 publicly traded firms. And of course, there's one biggest firm, Walmart has about 1 million employees. Amazon catching up quickly at 900K when I last looked. But this is just a snapshot, and really this is a much more dynamic picture than what you're seeing here. Every month in America, about 50,000 firms come and go. Now, of course, COVID has made this weird, but some of you will know that from March to June of last year, firm formation basically stopped in the U.S. But then from June, for the second half of last year, firm formation went wild, and we had a ton of firms coming and going. But anyways, in steady state, this replenishes the 6 million, but this is per month notice. So it means you have over 500,000 firms coming and going every year. And I'll show you some more data on that in a minute. Now, the labor pool is equally dynamic. And so this is, on any given month, pre-COVID anyway, we had roughly 2 million people coming and going every month into the unemployment pool, into and out of. And then you also have people retiring, students coming into the workforce, et cetera. That's surprisingly another 2 million per month. Moms going off to have babies, dads taking maternity leave, et cetera. But the single largest job flow is this job to job flux one, where basically, you have a job at company A and you leave it for company B, and you never experience the unemployment pool. That's 3 million per month. So you add up these fluxes, and by the way, these are in each direction. So it's 2 million, 4 million, 6 million, 8 million, because there's 2 million each one of the directions down there. Plus, so it's like 11 million people every month changing jobs or going in and out of this labor force. So it's a giant dynamic picture, and we want to have an explanation for this. We want to build up a model which can explain these large flows. So I'm going to pick out some of these things, and we're going to talk about these. All right. So going back now to when these data were first kind of well understood, we have this idea of the big employment pool, unemployed, out of the labor force pool, and you have these fluxes between them. When we first got the data, Bob Hall over at Stanford said, these rates of job separation are really high, surprisingly high, given the fact that, there are still, those of us who are tenured professors stay in our job for 20 or 30 years, whatever it is, right? So my goal in building a model of the whole thing, I would like to be able to explain this. I'd like to be able to say, can I get these kinds of fluxes, these kinds of flows to happen from the bottom up? Anyways, so there is a conventional explanation of this process, these large scale fluxes and flows. And that is to say that the economy is in equilibrium, but it keeps getting hammered by shocks, right? It keeps getting pummeled by exogenous shocks to oil prices or whatever it is, right? So there are conventional theories. Here's a paper from the Journal of Economic Theory from a decade ago, a well-known paper, which basically says, I'll just summarize it quickly and say that, idiosyncratic productivity shocks and frictions keep, keep smashing the economy, and that produces all kinds of internal flows and fluxes. Okay, that's one possible idea, that you have these idiosyncratic shocks. Now, it could be the productivity shocks could be due to technology changes, etc. But that's one possibility. Today, I'm going to show you a model where we don't have any of this. Okay, where we get something that looks the same kind of output, but without this kind of whacking the economy with exogenous shocks. So here's what I'm going to talk about today primarily. Imagine that labor markets are not in equilibrium, okay? So that we basically get persistent flows of people between jobs. And I'm not going to assume this. I'm not going to, drive it this way. I'm going to have this emerge. The workers are going to be heterogeneous. They're going to there's going to be basically notion that when people change jobs, it's going to cause ripple effects in the economy, and they're going to have downstream turnover effects. And this is going to cause output fluctuations, and this is going to, some firms gain, some firms lose from these kinds of things. And then we're going to basically produce labor market flux out of this whole thing. And notice that this is going to be a completely endogenous story associated with, why people are changing jobs and how it manifests itself, how it perturbs the rest of the economy. So I'm going to talk about a model basically with endogenous dynamics. All right, that's going to be this is the point of departure versus an exogenous story of shocks. This is an endogenous story of and it says the last thing, of course, is the question that I'm going to answer in the affirmative. Can a mechanism generate enough internal dynamism? When we first started doing this work, we thought maybe we'll have to shock the economy as well as having endogenous shocks. But I'm going to show you that the endogeneity can handle what we need. Okay, so what is the data pool here? What is the data source? So I sit in Washington. I have access over the years. I've gained access to these data. What are these data on from the tax records? Basically, IRS makes available to census information on all the firm tax records. So firms by sizes. Now, various kinds of sizes. How many employees? That's input. How many receipts? Output. Market cap, all that kind of stuff. We have a variety of measures of depreciation, et cetera, that appears on the tax return data. I have access to it, right? And then firm ages. How long have firms been filing tax returns under the same tax ID number or whatever it is, right? So we have firm sizes and ages, and then of course we can start slicing and dicing firm sizes by age, firm ages by size, et cetera. Also things like productivity, output per unit of input, and then we can slice and dice this thing by size needs. I'm going to show you guys what some of these patterns that we've discovered in these data. Firm growth rates, change of size over time, annually. Now I can once again slice and dice it by size and age and productivity if I want to. Employment, who's working for what firm. Think about it this way: that every tax return from a company has a bunch of stuff in there associated with a unique ID number for all the employees, right? So Walmart's tax return, in principle, has 1.5 million employees in there somewhere. So you can do a lot of stuff with these kinds of data. Tenure, how long do people stay in their jobs? Once again, slice it and dice it by productivity. So I'm going to show you some data today on networks. The network stuff does not come from the tax return data, since the tax return data is individual firms, but we can get data in other ways. So the main thing to say here is that there's a broad pool of data we can get on this. Remember, and this is resolved at the level of individual firms. So if there are 6 million firms in America with employees, I'm going to get all this stuff on every single firm. Okay. Now, due to privacy concerns, et cetera, I'm not actually going to show you guys today any individual record data, but I am going to show you data about that's been summarized in various ways. All right.
So actually, getting to this is highly sensitive, obviously, data. So
yes.
In real use case, how restricted is its use to various actors, and how, in order to use it, how much do you have to desensitize the output of your model to hide all the sensitive data that went into it?
Yes, so it's a good question, Greg. So we could do a 45-minute presentation just on that.
Yes.
How about if I give you the 2.5
the highlights? Yeah.
And we can do more or less as you wish. So basically, the idea is that although in principle I can touch individual records, what I really end up doing is I really end up just asking for the bin data. So say ages. I just say, in the year 2012, what is the age distribution of all of American companies? And Alphabet's going to be in there in one of the bins. I don't know which bin you guys are in. Okay. So it turns out in practice, I touch the query touches at every individual record, and every individual line in the firm record. But then I don't actually look at that. I just look at some summary of that. Either, basically, I wrote in the last bullet here, we're not going to run regressions. What I really do, though, I really have exotic binning techniques where I bin this stuff down to find out how many firms are, in each one in some category that I make for each one of these different dimensions of firm data. Now, if in fact one of my bins ends up with only a couple companies in it, then they're going to complain to me. They're going to say, we don't want to give you that data. They're going to put a D in that bin for disclosure problem. And then I have a choice. I can either have them do legal analysis of whether if it's truly a disclosure problem, and I got to pay them like $5,000 for the lawyers to be involved, which I do often. Now, often we'll try that. Or I can just say I'm going to make the bin fatter and put more firms in there, and I'm not going to worry about the disclosure problem. So in general, everything I'm going to show you guys today, what I'm going to show you guys today is for across all these different data categories here. I'm going to show you detailed, histograms. I'm going to show you detailed patterns and gross regularities in every one of these categories that are previously unknown. I assert that they're previously unknown. Maybe some of them have been known by specialists, but I'm going to show you gross patterns that we've teased out from these things. Because we're dealing only with the gross patterns, Greg, we're not going to get hit by privacy burdens here or privacy problems. Now, there are going to be some areas where we do run up against those things, but for this presentation today, I've kind of called those out and separated those out. Is that a good enough answer for now?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, that's great. Thank you.
And as I go through these data, my idea was to go through just a swath of these data. I'm going to, of the 4 or 5 dozen gross regularities we found, I'm going to show you like half of that or a third of that, and we can hopefully you get a sense of what those are as we go forward here. But it does bring up this question, and I put this slide in just for today's talk. But hopefully it's relevant to your question. I think that what we could do with these microscopic data, we could really try to forecast the temporal, near-term evolution of every one of these firms, right? We could do that. We could say, like, what's Ford going to do tomorrow? What's GM going to do tomorrow? And we could also say, like, what's the 7-Eleven on the corner down here going to do tomorrow? In general, we're not going to do that. I'm not going to do that because I'm basically going to say, I don't care whether the corner store is a Wawa, which is East Coast. I think you guys don't have that on the West Coast. East Coast convenience store, or it's a 7-Eleven. I don't really care. I don't care if it's a dry cleaner or a deli on my corner. All I care is that there's some economic activity there. And some of you will know, actually, in statistical physics, this is sometimes called the Feigenbaum critique. Feigenbaum says, if we have some chaotic system, why waste all of our clock cycles computing some local structure that's just going to evolve anyway? It's not going to be. We don't need that local structure in order to figure out what's going on at the macroscopic level. So what I'm going to do instead is what bullet number 2 says here is I'm going to try to reproduce the structure, the overall structure of the economy, without worrying whether I've got 7-Eleven or Wawa on the corner store. Okay, so hopefully that's I'm painting this kind of with a coarse brush here. I'm just saying I don't really care about the super microscopic details. I only care about kind of getting the overall structure right. I'm still going to represent every single entity in the economy, but I don't really care whether if Alphabet has one location in Pittsburgh, another location in Washington D.C. I don't care about getting the address right, for example. Okay, but now there are within this ABM. ABM is, once again, we haven't talked about it yet, but I'm going to talk about it in a second. Agent-based modeling world. There are both kinds of models. So with John Giannakopoulos at Yale and a bunch of other people, Peter Howard, et cetera, I did create this one model of the U.S. housing market bubble. Some of you may have seen this paper, but it was in the AER a couple of years ago. So in this model, now we do actually say we care. For example, we got the whole housing stock of a big American city with millions of homes in it, and we said, let's actually try to put a specific household in that specific house and try to model why they did what they did with refinancing or cash out or whatever it is. And we try to model the housing bubble with getting every individual, entity correct. And it turns out that actually had many problems. And if we have time at the end, we can come back and discuss that. What I'm going to do today is the second item, number 2 down here, firms, where it says firms, U.S. private sector. I'm gonna ignore the fact that Greg works at Google and Rob works at George Mason. I'm gonna ignore that stuff. I'm gonna say Google has somebody who has the same income as Greg, and George Mason is somebody with the same income as Rob, and that's all we really need to move forward here. Right? I don't have specific characteristics of workers, for example, from these tax data anyway. So there's no sense getting too far buried in the details. So I'm going to basically show a model today where I'm going to get 6 million firms to happen like the real world, but I'm not really going to get General Motors, Ford, and Alphabet coming out. So hopefully this will become clear as we go forward. Now, there's no reason why you couldn't do the first one, and I say we tried that with housing. But that's not what I'm going to present today. So there's at least I've written here 2 flavors. There's at least 2 flavors. There's probably other flavors too, but this is at least 2 different flavors of when you have the microdata, how you might proceed. Okay, so this is just showing several dozen here of these firm level data that we have. Once again, in various kinds of bins. And I'm just going to show you guys a cross section of these things going forward here. And once again, the first third of our book is all about the data. Okay, so I'm going to try to march through this in about 10 or 15 minutes. Then I'm going to go show you the model in 10 or 15 minutes, and then we'll be done. All right. So this just shows a gross time series. Once again, just to calibrate you guys. I mean, I started earlier. There were 120 million workers in 6 million firms. Notice really since 2000 and since the dot-com bubble, we've had almost 6 million firms and almost 120 million workers. And we had fluctuations above here, right? After the dot-com bubble burst, we had some shrinkage of the number of employees, and then the financial crisis, number of employees shrunk again. But in the Trump administration, it got up to maybe about 130 million employees, a little over 6 million firms. But now, of course, we're down below that number with COVID. Okay, so that's a basic kind of overall picture here. But now some of you will know my paper from Science from many years ago when the first time these data were the IRS has what they call the Business Master File, BMF, and that has basically the data on all American businesses on one giant file. Turns out it actually was on many different machines and not in one file, even though it was called the Business Master File up until about the year 2000, and finally put on one giant machine in Detroit at the time. So this was the idea that there's at least in 2000 there was one firm with 1 million employees. That was Walmart. It's now up to 1.5 million, by the way. It's grown a lot. And there were progressively large numbers of progressively smaller firms. So obviously this was some binning this was a binning that I had requested that census do for me. And then we get things out of here like, once again, the average firm size is 20. That's 120 million divided by 6 million. But notice that the modal firm size in America is 1 employee, right? So there's this very skewed distribution. Some of you guys, particularly you guys who are economists, will recognize this as the Pareto distribution. But in particular, the slope is very near 1. So for the PDF, the slope's 2. For the CDF, the slope's 1. And so this is going to be what's called a ZIF distribution, or basically it's a Pareto distribution with exponent 1. And this plays an important role in a lot of other things than social sciences, but I'll come back to that at the end if there's time. Okay, just to do it more, what I showed you is this one on the left, which is my custom binning, and once again, that involves me going to census and asking for a special request. But you can actually reproduce the same thing by using their data. Their data are not equally binned in size. We don't have equal bin sizes, but there are ways to compute it. I'm just trying to show now a bunch of different representation of the same thing here. It turns out whether you do workers or whether you do receipts, you get the same slope, the same representation, a little bit of departure at the small end here, but otherwise it looks the same. And then we can do, in economics, we're used to looking at inequality, looking at things that are quite disparate in size by doing Lorenz curves and Gini coefficients. And this is the Lorenz curves for U.S. firms. In our book, we actually show this as in a different way, which is a little more. It's very hard to read this thing, right, in the sense that it's so steep here. But it says that the biggest 5% of firms have about 80% of all employees. So it's a very skewed structure, obviously. And so we spend time unpacking that in the book. I'm just going to skip it for now or go quickly beyond it. One thing to say is that firm sizes are stationary. This is now, I plotted 12 years of data here. And except for the financial crisis year 2009, notice that the data all overlap each other. And so they're roughly a stationary distribution of firm sizes. It doesn't change very much. Either individual firms, and I have here now, I have, Dell, FedEx, Microsoft, Walmart. Individual firms are getting bigger monotonically, this young, big firms, growing firms. Oh, this is a plot from a guy from Minnesota named Lutmer. So just over the last 40 years, you had this fluctuation of unemployment up and down. That's the irregular line. But these young firms grow like mad. I mean, right here, I think Home Depot grew from 5 employees up to 500,000 or something over the last 30, 40 years. So, but individual firms are migrating up and down this distribution. But notice the whole thing is stationary. So you're getting when firms grow, other firms shrink. By the way, there's nothing metaphysical about this in the sense that regulations can break it. And the example is France here. This is a couple guys at the IMF did this. There are EU regulations that kick in France or in Europe. And so there are too many size 49, 48, 47, 46 companies in France, not enough 51, 52, 53s. And the same is true. A bunch of local regulations kick in at size 10. So there's too many size 8, 9, 7, 8, 9 companies, not enough size 10, 11, 12. It's interesting how that you can break it. By the way, it was a claim that the Obamacare regulations, which kick in at size 50, would cause a deviation in the U.S., but that has not happened. Okay, now just as a practical matter, it turns out in the book we spend a bunch of time doing these kind of calculations. If f of s is the firm size distribution, let's weight the darn thing by, the trouble with the firm size distribution is that, Axtell Consulting and Alphabet are both considered one data point. Let's weight this thing by how big we are. So you guys have a lot of employees. I have 0 or 1 employee, depending on how you count. And so we can do a weighted distribution. This thing ends up being here now. We get something that's more reasonable, I think, in terms of what is a typical firm. So the median firm size in America, according to this kind of weighted distribution, is size 500. Basically, half of Americans work in firms that are bigger than 500, half of Americans work in firms that are smaller than 500. It's just, and you can do the same thing for receipts, you get roughly the same picture. Just another way to think about firm sizes. Establishments. Many firms have multiple establishments, that is, multiple locations, and that's another power law we're getting out here. Both for establishment size, but also for how many establishments per firm. And I've just written it here for the first 2 decades or so of establishments per firm. Some of you guys will know that fast food restaurants typically have 10,000 establishments. McDonald's has 25,000 establishments, and that's another power law that falls out of this stuff. Anyway, just kind of marching on. Once again, I'm just showing you all these data. I'm showing you these data because these are what we're going to try to hit with one model. We're going to try to grow from the bottom up all these features that are, once again, these are the result of touching individual firm records, but I'm only showing it in this summary form. What is output just in terms of receipts per employee, the crudest measure of labor productivity? I've broken up into small, medium, and large firms, and we're going to get these. Look at these interesting tails we get. This is once again plotted in log productivity. This is dollars per worker, and these are just counts. How many firms have what productivity? Look, there are 100 firms in America, small firms, where they produce $100 million of output per employee. I mean, it's just unbelievable how much output you get. Now, these are probably going to be things like, LeBron James Inc. and that kind of stuff thing. Once again, I could go in and look at that. I'm not going to do that. There's no reason for me to actually tease that out. But the main thing to say is we have another power law tail here. Power law slope here is not 1, but 1.6. Just as a footnote, notice big firms like you guys can't have this enormous productivity. You guys have regression to the mean on productivity. If in fact, you guys, or imagine if Walmart, say one of the biggest firms, had productivity like LeBron James Inc., Walmart itself could run the whole gosh darn economy. Walmart could be like a Soviet American economy. One firm would run the whole darn thing, and the rest of us could sit around and write poetry or something. So anyways, this is another gross thing we want to hit, another shape we'd like to hit. There's some implication of this kind of productivity stuff for trade theory, but I'll skip that for now. Firm ages. Every line here is the age distribution of American firms in a specific year. Okay, so the different colors there's like 2012, 13, 14, 15. The main thing to say is that when you superimpose them, actually these are pre-crisis. This will be like 2007, 8, 6, 7, 8, 9, that kind of thing. You're going to get you're going to get basically a stationary distribution of firms by age. I've actually got it in logarithmic coordinates here, so this is not an exponential distribution, but it's a Weibull shape. The dots are a fit of a discrete Weibull to this thing. Once again, this has not been known until you look at the data at this level of all 6 million firms. So these are new results. Post-crisis, it turns out the crisis years 2009, 10, 11, 12, 13 are in these colors. I guess as you go from red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, violet here, we're going from 2000, 15, 14, 13, 12, 11. There are these deviations associated with the financial crisis when a bunch of firms went out of business. And so anyways, this is just an example where we have non-stationarity post-crisis. We're basically transiting to a new age distribution here. It's going to be along this line here where my mouse is, if you can see that, not departing from the previous one here.
So what you're saying here is that the curve shifted and you just observe all. Are you saying there was a lot of failures at one time? Is it a bubble, or the whole shape is shifting?
Excellent question. There's 2 things going on. One is that there's been a shift in the curve. So now we're moving on to this other slope here where my mouse is. But notice that we're getting about 8% of new firms. 8% of firms are new firms. Back before the crisis, it's about 10%. So we have 2 effects here. One is we're getting just there's lower firm creation going on since the financial crisis over the last decade, lower firm creation, and it's thus putting us on this new trajectory here. By the way, these data are somewhat well understood by people in industrial organization, but they have never plotted this age distribution thing before. So we have a paper sitting in Science now trying to get this stuff published. But yeah, these are new things that people have not seen before. Okay, so then lifetimes. Basically ages are one thing. Lifetimes are basically when you go out of business. In essence, the slope of this age plot is a measure of how many firms are going out of business, right? I mean, we have this many firms age 8, this many firms age 10, this many firms age 15. The slope of this thing is a measure of how much or what firms are going out of business. So that's lifetimes. So once again, lifetimes before the crisis, a beautiful stationary figure here. Lifetimes post-crisis, we get some noise at the lowest level. But basically, once again, the stationary distribution of lifetimes. This is now not a Weibull, but basically there's a close relationship between the ages and lifetimes of a firm. And in our book, we go through all the math of this. But main thing to say, once again, a gross pattern we'd like to hit here. It turns out you can then compute things like, what is the exit probability? And I said we can slice and dice these data. Have exit probability by size and age. Let me just skip the details. In the interest of time, we can come back to it. Say one thing you get out of this, though, is that big firms and old firms have a lot longer to live. And so you can compute something called expected remaining lifetime. This is something that's common in reliability literature, like, what's the chance that a machine's going to break down or whatever. So it turns out most biological things have the property that the expected remaining lifetime shrinks with age, right? As we get older, our expected remaining lifetime shrinks. But for firms, it's exactly the reverse, which is very interesting, right? That basically, when a firm was born, the expected lifetime is about 14 years. But if you can make it to age 25, now you're going to live for another 24 years. And if you make it to age 80, you're going to live for another 30 years or something, right? So the idea is that there's this very non-biological aspect of firms by firm lifetimes. I'm going to just kind of march through this stuff quickly. Entrance, we give you. I'm showing you the time series now for entrance. About 500K per year fell during the financial crisis. It's also a power law distribution of firms by how big they are when they enter. Right, there are a few giant entrants that happen, typically through chapter 7, 11 type stuff. By the way, this slope is no longer 1. It slopes about 1.5. So basically, it's not as skew as the real distribution of firms. Exits are similar. I thought, wait, I don't have exits here. Sorry, I thought I had exits there. My exits are very similar to entrance. So I think I just left that slide out. Growth rate. Okay, so
the entrances. How can you enter with 1,000? Can you explain?
Yeah, so basically, there are a bunch of firms that would say, imagine that a firm literally goes out of business for some reason. Think about so for some firm, just maybe for some financial reason, or for some exogenous shock potentially, or just maybe like I'm thinking like maybe thinking like shale oil and there's some shock to oil prices. Firm goes out of business. But they basically keep the team together and they reconstitute themselves under some new management, new financing, new something or other.
Oh, okay.
As long as they get a new tax number, they could come back together at size maybe 5,000 or something. That's not uncommon. And you see, and basically what you're seeing here is every colored line represents a different year here, and I've actually fit a solid blue line to the whole thing. But it turns out this is quite robust across many different years. Okay, growth rates. This is now, once again, when you do all 6 million firms, you get these incredible patterns that arise. This is now, so once again, size of time t plus 1 over size of time t is cap g growth rate. Take the log of that of cap g, and you get this, to separate this by subtraction. This is now a plot of just the counts of how many firms have what growth rate. And so what you basically see here are, I've separated this out by firm size. Once again, slicing and dicing by firm size. Age I can also do. We do that in the book. I'm not showing it here. But basically, the smallest firms are the blue ones. Next size red, et cetera, up to the purple ones are the biggest. What you basically see is that small firms have a lot of variability in how much they grow from year to year. Over here, where my mouse is positive growth. Over here is negative growth. Firms getting smaller. And you also see a certain kind of asymmetry to the whole thing, which is interesting. Now this is the annual growth rate. By the way, this is very non-Gaussian. In this coordinate system, I've got log frequency versus log growth rate. If these growth rates were log normal, the small g would be normal, and so this should be in this coordinate system. This Gaussian should be a parabola through here. This is kind of anti-parabola, right? It's kind of convex to the origin of 0 here. So if you do it on a 5-year, well, I guess the 5-year time scale is later on. We can actually plot what is the average growth rate as a function of firm size, and this is always interesting. People are always surprised by this if you haven't seen it before. Economists know this, but most non-economists don't know it. As firms get big, they typically have negative growth rate on average. There are occasionally some big firms. I showed you a picture of some of the small ones or some of the young ones that have grown a lot. But typically, big firms, particularly big old firms, shed employees on average. We also check how does the variance of this distribution change with firm size, and you get some relations here in terms of the blue and black, just depending on whether you consider the outliers. Yes or no? Okay. Oh, here I've got exit. I just exit in the wrong order. Sorry, my slides are in slightly messed up order. Once again, get about, for the whole thing to be steady state, we need to have about 500,000 exiters. Back when the number of firms were growing, we had fewer than that, but now we reached the steady states with a constant number of firms roughly. And once again, you get a power law and exits too. Once again, this power law follows 1.5. Again, it's much more like the entrance and the exits have the same size distribution, probably because some of the exiters are going to come back in Chapter 11, Chapter 7 as entrance again. Job tenure. I'm getting to the end of these data here. I want to show the model. But just these are all just targets we're going to try to hit. There are a few people who keep their job for 25 years in the U.S. economy, but there are progressively larger numbers of people who keep their job for progressively shorter times. So the average here is about 3.5, by the way. People keep their jobs on average about 3.5 years in the U.S. And now we can slice and dice this by firm size and firm age. How does the turnover? Well, I got turnover here based on firm size, firm age. Once again, just kind of gross patterns. Every color is a different year. But the main thing to say, these are roughly stationary rates when you look at it over time. Employee turnover by worker age. Now this is a cool one. We really had to work on the data. Say, how old are the workers in the economy, and then what is turnover? But this was a fun one. But once again, you get kind of this is actually a power law for turnover for it's log coordinates is roughly a straight line. But so these are all targets we're going to try to hit. Some other things. This is now not my work. This is from among the publicly traded firms. This was a PNAS paper from about a decade ago. The red firms here are going to be the U.S. automakers, big three automakers. Yellow are their suppliers, at least the suppliers that are in the Fortune 1000, I think it is. This is the rest of the supply chain network for the rest of the Fortune. I think it's Fortune 1000, maybe Fortune 500. I can't remember. But the main thing to say is that this is just a network, right? Giant network. It has a certain degree distribution, and it's roughly another power law. Log coordinates, you get a quasi straight line for the degree distribution. We don't have great data about this in the U.S. It turns out in Japan now, there is now a data set, there are actually 2 different data sets in Japan that actually are a comprehensive supplier-buyer network for the entire country. They've kind of outrun us in terms of data availability. A similar one is this one. Once again, US data are not great, so this is my student Omar from Stat Finland. Every dot is a firm. Every edge is if you can, it's hard to see the edges because there's so many of them, but this is every firm in Finland, 200,000 firms or something. There's an edge between them if in fact a worker has left one firm and gone to another. Now this is a K-core decomposition of the whole giant assemblage of firms, but this is just a giant graph, right? Giant network, and so it has graph properties, and so it has properties we'd like to hit. Things like as we model workers moving between firms. Here is the degree distribution of that network in power law. In log coordinates, so another power law. Here are the weights. Now, how many workers are moving between the different firms? What is the clustering coefficient of this thing? Now, we weren't sure whether the data were very robust, so not only did we do it for Finland, we also then got data from Mexico, and Mexico came out to be very similar. Notice here for these same little messier down here on this assortativity measure. Anyways, final thing to say is we have a whole section of our book about city sizes, and some of you will know the work of the famous Professor Ziff, where in his book from the 1940s, he plots this thing about how have the size of U.S. cities changed over time, and he gets this incredible kind of just the balloon is inflating. And we're getting bigger and bigger cities here, but it follows the same gross pattern of the rank versus the size of the darn things. New York is the biggest city here, but back here I think it's Boston or Philadelphia. So it turns out we can do the same thing, and what we've done is because we have the data on firms, we're saying, well, the red line here would be Ziff's data, how many residents in the city. The orange line is how many employees there are in the city. The green line is how many business establishments there are. And the blue line is how many business firms there are. Notice, it doesn't matter how you do it, you're going to get the same kind of relationship, right? It's the same heavy-tailed process. Probably this is for the 900 micropolitan and metropolitan cities. In basically every city in America, more than 25,000 workers is plotted here. Now, this is the ranks. This is the famous Ziff rank size plot. You can just do it though as a conventional, a probability density function. You're going to get that. Okay. Summary of all these data. I've shown you firm sizes, productivity, ages, and growth rates, etc. And what I want to do now, and I apologize for running through this so fast, but I'm just going to march on. I've only left myself 10 minutes to do the model, so that's on me here. The idea of the model is, there are many different theories of the firm. Let's try to use them to understand all these data. And we're taking the approach here, we're going to let the data kind of drive our modeling. And so some of you may know this kind of, recent philosophy of social science stuff about models mediate between theory and the data. And so that's what approach we're taking here. This is Mary Morgan and Margaret Morrison in the UK. So now those of you who are economists, when I was in graduate school, I was studying, Ronald Coase and Jensen and Meckling, et cetera, many different theories of the firm. None of these theories, it turns out, even though they're associated with very famous names here, none of these theories are really useful, it turns out, to explain the microscopic structure of the data. I was a student of Herbert Simon, so the Carnegie School is something I have a great affinity for. But we can't. It's hard to understand. Maybe the evolutionary approach of Sid Winter and Dick Nelson is closest, but hard to use these theories to explain these microscopic data. So what we're going to basically do is build a computational model. I'm going to do it at full scale. Now, it turns out I'm not going to show you the way we actually did it, which was much more evolutionary, where in the 90s, when I first started playing around with these kinds of things, really could only do, say, 10K agents, and it would take over a night to produce a steady state out of this. But, a decade, in the first decade of this century, we got up to 1 million agents running on a 2-core workstation. It still took a couple of days to equilibrate the thing with kind of hand-coded C code. And then I'm going to show you the results today from a model with 100 million agents, actually 120 million agents, full scale. It runs on a 96-core workstation that we kind of put together ourselves using C14 threads, a bunch of RAM. And this thing, we've optimized it. So it used to take us about 6 or 8 hours to equilibrate the thing. It's now down to about 45 minutes on this 96-core workstation. All right. So now for those of you guys who have never seen ABMs before, which we're talking about basically a population of software agents. Now in our case, it's going to be both employee agents and firm agents. 120 million employees, 6 million firms. Although the number of firms is going to be something which is emergent. Every agent has a utility function. Every agent pursues utility gains. The whole economic environment is going to evolve. The kind of economic environment, basically, how many firms there are, and we're going to try to get everything to emerge from the bottom up. Now, so the basic idea here is I'm going to instantiate 120 million workers, and the question is, what rules of microeconomic behavior will produce 6 million firms? With employees. I wanted those 6 million firms, though, also to not be static, but actually to produce endogenously 3 million job changes per month. 50 to 100,000 startups a month. 20,000 biggest firms. These are the public ones. With basically, I want to get one firm with 1 million employees, right? So these are just the targets. I painted the targets here. These are half a dozen important targets, but there are many more, of course. By the way, I put the pictures here. I'm doing this talk from upstate New York. This is Watkins Glen here, and this is my kid's HO track. I'm gonna try to do the thing at full scale, just because it turns out it makes life easier in the sense of I can compare the output of the model directly to the data I've just shown you. Okay, so the operational question is, what microeconomic specification can give me this kind of can give me the right answer? And you're going to see in qualitative terms, here are the ingredients. Okay, I'm going to have a heterogeneous set of agents. To make them homogeneous, I can't get the right answer out, for example. I'm going to put them in an environment of increasing returns to scale. This is going to be Holmstrom-like team production. Those of you who know the work of Holmstrom. They're going to kind of co-evolve or adjust their behavior to what everybody else is doing in their team. And it turns out that agents are going to be not really rational in the traditional game theoretic sense, but they're going to be kind of like, they're going to be purposive in a way that I'll talk about in a second. There's a compensation system, and there's going to be a social network by which agents are going to learn about other jobs. In a world of 6 million firms, there's not going to be a public bulletin board where all 6 million firms are going to post how they're doing. Rather, you have to find a job through somebody who tells you about a job. Okay. So what this model describes is a conventional labor-leisure trade-off model, and I hesitate to go into the details here too far, just because it'll take up too much time. But I'll summarize it as follows: we're going to give every agent a utility function. So look at the last line here. The utility function says that they like the income they get from working. They also like the leisure they get from not working. What is their income? Their income is this share up here, which says this is the income I get from working with effort level E sub I, when the rest of the people on my team have effort level E not I. And if alpha is 0 here, I'm going to basically have equal division of the output between the workers. If alpha is 1, I'm going to get proportional compensation of the workers based on how much effort they put in. Any alpha between 0 and 1 is going to be satisfactory for what I'm going to show you subsequently. Now, the key to this increasing returns to scale model is that the total effort in the team is capital E, where everybody's putting in effort level between 0 and 1, and there's going to be the output's going to be some superlinear function of the input. Now I've got in here the exponent is 2. I'm going to eventually show you the model we're going to have is going to have the exponent beta between 1 and 2, but you'll see how that works in a second. Now the key idea here is that agents are not going to know what the best thing to do in this complex environment is. They're going to basically just seek utility improvements by kind of groping for how much effort to put into the whole thing. Once again, in the interest of time, this is the 2-agent version of how this works. I think what I might do here is just go through this in 30 seconds, and if we can come back to it if there are questions. In a 2-agent team, this is the effort level of agent 1, effort level of agent 2, and I've drawn ISO utility lines for agent 1. They're the U-shaped ones. ISO utility lines for agent 2, they're the C-shaped ones. And the point here is that where it says N, this is a Nash equilibrium. Now, first of all, Nash equilibrium always exists for this, in this case, a 2-person game, a team production game. Holmstrom showed that basically agents undersupply effort. That is, this is in this lens-shaped region here above the N. Agents are both better off in this team production environment, but these are not incentive compatible. Basically, all the points up here are not incentive compatible, and agents kind of walk their way back to the Nash level. So this is what Holmstrom showed back in the 80s, a moral hazard in teams, famous paper. What we show in our book is that this endpoint, this Nash equilibrium, at least in this continuous action space we have here, is dynamically unstable. That is, if the team is big enough. Now, in a small team, if there are some perturbations, it'll just you move back to the Nash level. But in a big team, this Nash level would just lead to some kind of crazy cycling or some very complex dynamics. So we imagine that an agent who's in a team that's not doing well could look for another job somewhere else. So here's the basic idea of the model I'm going to show you at full scale. Imagine that this is 5 firms, A through E, 13 agents, 1 through 13. Imagine that agent 6 leaves firm B. Agent 10 has some incentive to move to firm B. Agent 9 is going to go do a startup, and agent 11 shuts down firm D. Well, we still have 5 firms in the next time period, notice, but one firm, D, is gone, a new firm is formed. We have the same 13 agents, but now they're in different configuration. So imagine this thing now running, and now this is the very first version we ever got running of this model 20 years ago now with only 500, it says 1,000 agents, but I think it's actually only 500. And every horizontal line now, this is actual computational, this is a movie from a simulation of this model. Every horizontal line is a firm. You see little proto firms going up. As you know, there's an advantage to being in a team. So basically, firm agents join other workers and they form a team. Now the key dynamic here is that once a team starts getting big, every worker just figures out they can shirk a little bit, and they're still getting high payoff because of the increasing returns to scale, but they can shirk a little bit and get away with it. Now the red agent here is the firm founder. In some versions of the model, the firm founder can fire people. Some versions he can't. But you see firms growing up. But eventually, when a firm gets very large, it's going to get kind of overrun by shirkers, and people, particularly people with high preference for income, are going to say, "I want to get out of here. I can do better somewhere else. I can do better at a neighboring firm or something." So basically, this is not going to run away to one giant firm, one humongous firm of all the workers in it. Although it could, it won't, because what's going to happen is, for example, if I can't pause the thing. Sorry. What you basically find is that the average effort level in the big firms are smaller than in the average effort level. Average effort level in the big firms is less than in the small firms. Okay, so why full-scale model? Well, of course, we couldn't do a full-scale model initially, but basically what the story here, and I don't have to tell you guys this, is that today we're living in this kind of computational zeitgeist associated with, can you build a brain from neurons? Can you build cells from the actual chemical reactions, whatever? So we're basically saying, let's try to build a model at full scale, every single worker, every single firm. Now, there's one important reason why not to do this, and that's my economists my colleagues who are economists don't really dig this, and so I have to say there's definitely kind of a hurdle associated with getting them to buy into it. Anyways, what I'm going to show you now are the results.
So, Rob, a question.
Yeah,
how do you choose the parameters? And maybe this is actually the time. Like, how do you calibrate it from
exactly?
data?
What I'm going to do, Greg, is the following, and so that's basically, I'm going to show you the set of parameters that works here, right here. So there are basically about a dozen parameters, things like some coefficients for the production, how much increasing returns to build in, how much heterogeneity put into the agents for the preference for income, that kind of thing. So here's what we do. I take those 4 or 5 or 6 dozen output measures that I showed you that are in the data, and I just grossly compare them to what comes out of this model. And then with that, and by the way, we do this totally heuristically. We do this visually because once again, with many different output measures, there's no kind of, how do I compare if I'm a little bit off on firm size versus a little more accurate on firm age? How do I trade those off? Well, so I basically imagine a giant dashboard. So we basically have created a giant dashboard in MATLAB that compares the outputs of really, it's like 4 dozen outputs. Okay, it's like 50 outputs. And we just start tweaking these. We move these dozen parameters around. Things like what is the size, how big is the social network, that kind of stuff, how many people are active every period, all this stuff. And we just found something that works pretty well. And I'm going to show you now how well it works. So I apologize that it's very heuristic, Greg, but is that a satisfactory answer for now?
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, so now I'm going to show you what we can get from this kind of heuristic calibration. We can get,
if you don't mind.
Yeah.
You're characterizing the humans. What about the firms? Do they also have different characteristics?
Well, see, okay, right. So now the way the firms work is a firm is really just an amalgam of different agents. So a firm's performance is going to be based on what its agents do. It is the case that this one parameter here, if you can see it, the beta parameter, when a firm is born, this is how much increasing returns it has. Every time a firm is born, it draws a random number between 1.5 and 2. Mm-hmm. And that determines how much increasing returns it has. So yes, every firm is idiosyncratic in this way, but then the actual output of the firm is based on how hard the workers in that firm are working. Is that clear?
Oh, yes. So basically this is essentially determined by the founder.
Exactly. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Okay, although I should say the founder could eventually leave too, right? But what we actually find is that it's these agents with the high theta, the guys who love income, are the first ones to leave a firm, and then they just turn over control to the agent with the second most seniority. That's how we do that. But we can come back to that detail. Anyways, what I'm going to now show you is the output. So basically, we can get in this model by that calibration, we get roughly 6 million firms to form. Now, this is once the thing has reached steady state. This is now running for 25 years. This is 300 months after that. So we run it for we get roughly 6 million firms to happen. That's quite stable. We're getting about 100,000 firms entering. Those are green. 100,000 firms exiting. That's red. Okay, and notice there's more volatility in the exiting than entering. That's also a feature of the data that I did not show you guys. Firm sizes. We can get out the proper distribution of firm sizes by workers. Firm sizes by output. And one thing I want to mention, these figures look a little bit different for the following reason. When of course we have the data coming from a model, I have no privacy worries now, right? So I don't have to bin the data. So what I showed you before was the bin data. If I bin this data, it looks the same as it did in the raw data or in the empirical data. But this is now just the output of the model. This is size 1, size 2, size 3, all the way up to size 3,921 or whatever it is, right? And now one of the most important features though is that both output and workers input are both power laws, right? But now look at this thing. What if I plot output versus firm size versus input? And now I'm going to just plot what is the average output versus the average input. Not every firm, but this is the average where I've now bended it a little bit here, right? What we have actually linear. Basically, as I double the firm, if I increase the firm size by a factor of 10, I get 10 times more output. But remember, I put into this model increased returns to scale, but we get out constant returns to scale. Why is that? Well, it's because basically, as firms get, the firms that are living up here where my mouse is, which basically have super linear output, it's always hard to hire somebody who's going to keep that output level in your firm. So basically, firms get driven onto this average surface by hiring people who are not going to work as hard as the people in the firm at time zero. So in essence, this is we get about. And by the way, if some of you will know if anybody if you guys are macroeconomists, you'll know that this is a feature of the real economic data as well. That we have, if you run regressions on all firms, you get basically constant returns to scale at the aggregate level. Now the fallacy of composition that people are that is commonly falls out of that is that people say, well, because we have constant returns at the aggregate level, we must have constant returns at the microscopic level. And I'm saying, here's a model with increased returns at the microscopic level that produces constant returns at the macroscopic level. I can come back to that at the end if we have time. Okay, the biggest firm. The biggest firm is about 1 million employees with those parameters. What's all these weird shapes up here for the biggest firm? These are, this is one firm that was the biggest firm, but this was declining. Then some other firm comes along and gets big and then declines. Another firm comes along. I should have colored these differently, but I did not do that. But this is very much like, in the real U.S. economy, this is over 25 years. This is like, GM was the biggest firm, then ExxonMobil was the biggest firm, then now Walmart's the biggest firm, and Amazon's coming along pretty soon, et cetera, et cetera. We're also getting the average firm sizes coming out right at 20. Productivity. The data on the left are from the real economy. On the right is what comes out of our model. We're also getting this heavy tail based on small, medium, and large size firms. It's not exactly the same thing, but it looks comparable, qualitatively at least. The colored lines here for ages are the data I showed you, and the dots are what comes out of our model. And so it has the right shape. It's off by a little bit, but it's pretty close. Firm growth rates. We are getting the same kind of growth rates as in the real world. We have these, small firms have got more volatility, more variability in the growth rates. Big firms have less. Should look like this. It doesn't look exactly the same, but looks quite similar. Job tenure. The data are up here. The model output is here. This is something which we calibrate to get the turnover to come out just about right. Labor flow networks. This is this business about that we got the data on Finland and Mexico. The data should look like the inset, which are the data, and our model produces things that look very much like the inset. Our model tends to be less noisy, so the real world data are much more noisy here. Our model, is a little bit more regular than that stuff. Okay, so now in this book, I've only kind of shown you kind of the most gross features of it. We have whole chapters then on where we now perturb the basic rules. We say, what if people are more or less rational? What if the networks are small world versus power law networks, whatever? We change a bunch of stuff and we see how it matters. And so that goes, and that's the kind of second half of the book. And then the website with code. So I put in these couple slides for you guys. Well, I'll finish up in a minute or two here. How do we realize 10 to the 8th agents? Because this is something quite, something novel, and economists typically don't work in this area, and even multi-agent system computer scientists, my sense, I hang around the AMOS meeting every year, and typically large-scale models are not that common. So I've written here, we typically need to have 1 kilobyte per agent, so we need about 100 gigabytes of RAM. And so I'm going to report to you now, just telling you guys what we spent about a decade trying to figure out how to do this efficiently, and I'm summarizing a decade of what doesn't work here. We tried we tried vector supercomputing, typical old-fashioned Cray machine. That's not going to work because this model is not synchronous. Clouds don't work because we have dense interactions, and its models run slower on a cloud than on just a simple workstation. We never got MPI to work very well because we never found that distributed memory systems work well. I'm going to talk a minute about having shared memory works much better. Java does too much time. A giant Java model, this many agents, spends almost all this time garbage collecting, so that's not very helpful. And then a whole variety. We played with all these different languages, and we've also played with Go. I know you guys probably have expertise in Go. We had mixed experience with Go, but I can talk about that at the end of this time. Here's what works for us. A giant flat memory space and some OS to address it, right? So, we need to be able to talk to, a terabyte of RAM if you got it. Lots of processors, the more the better. Although it turns out we tried this on the Pittsburgh Supercomputing Center's 20K core machine bridges. It's kind of, turns out 100 cores is what we know how to work well with. We haven't really gotten up to 20,000 cores working well. So we've written this thing in C, C++. We've used various flavors of OpenMP or Intel threaded building blocks. Some this. GPUs a little bit. GPUs initially we had some progress with, but then we kind of stalled on that. The synchronous aspect of GPUs seemed to be putting some artifacts into our code. We didn't like that, so we junked it. Anyways, what we currently have is you can buy a nice box, buy a nice Unix box. You guys will know this. A Unix box with 32 cores and 256 gigabytes of RAM. It's only $10K these days. And the machine I'm going to report, I've showed you results for, a box with 100 cores and a terabyte of RAM. You can get that for $25K ballpark. And what we can do with this is, we can basically, this model will run to a steady state, from a random initial condition in about an hour. Or really about 45 minutes is the current. And the great thing about this then is that because we're running the model at full scale, we can directly compare our model to the real world. So basically, this is just going to be a traditional fork join parallelism. We're going to start the model out. Every month, we're going to fork the agents, let them figure out where they want to work. Then we're going to bring them back together, compute some stats, fork the firms, let the firms produce some output. And every month we do this. We do this for a couple thousand months to reach a steady state. And then we'll run it for another 300 months to get another 25 years to get some robust data coming out of it. Okay, so I'm at the end now. We've really, in this case, built an economic model where we let the data tell us what targets we want to hit. There are these many statistics that I've shown you guys, many of them having the characteristic that they're power law or extreme heavy tailed. A model of teams can produce, teams with increasing returns to scale can get us to the right answer, get close to the right answer. We're using data on every single firm in America to do this. And the model is still relatively simple. Obviously, there are many ways to complicate it, and we're engaged in various ways to make the model more sophisticated today. One of the very important thing, particularly for those of you guys who are economists, is that notice in our model, we have no exogenous shocks anywhere. We just have individual actors pursuing their own self-interest, and this is going to give us dynamics across the thing. Basically, the summary is the microeconomic level is not an equilibrium, but we are getting macroscopic stationarity coming out from the thing overall. All right, so I'll stop here, and I apologize that I probably went over by a couple of minutes, but happy to take questions.
Yeah, thank you. Questions?
Yes. So for this model, I see that you do not differentiate the field of operation or like the product of the firm.
Yes, that's right.
So why, like, you can get away without like multidimensional space of the products?
Yeah. So let me just say that there is a version of this code which is much more of a macro model where we have firms making products. And let me just mention that. So back in the maybe 10 years ago, I had a big NSF grant to actually build a macroeconomic model in this type. What we found was that all the dynamics that I've just shown you here today can be had with a simpler model where we just say firms make output, the output gets sold. We imagine them in the markets work fine. The output gets sold, and then the firms receive compensation for that output. So we can in essence abstract from the whole product space. Now, but we do have a version of the code which has the product space in it. It's just that we don't need it to get the results that I've shown you here.
I see. So basically, if you wanted to build something specialized, it would pose extra restrictions on the flow of the workers. But in general, you expect that it would produce the same result.
Exactly. And let me just say that I think I have one other final slide here that I'm just skipping, but let me just pull up here quickly and say, what are some next steps with this thing? I mean, one thing that I think we're going to do once the book is out and we're finished with this specific thing is really imagine kind of this kind of model. The model of the private sector is kind of a model for the industrial base of a country, industrial base of the U.S. We'd like to put this as one component in a macro model, right? And so now we've got to add things like consumers and central banks, et cetera, et cetera.
Mm-hmm.
And so then at that point, we probably want to do a finer job on the whole product space, but. Let me just also mention that putting in the product space slows down the model by an order of magnitude, at least with the way we've got it currently coded. So I'm also a little bit worried that some of the sophistication that we want to do to make the model more realistic in some sense are going to cause going to give us computational challenges beyond what we already have.
And just an advertisement plug: you can rent a cloud machine with better characteristics that you are using for much cheaper.
Fair enough. But now, you guys probably know better than I do. But every time we tried cloud computing, what we find is these models which have very dense interactions, right? Which are going to be like firms. An agent's got a query not only what's going on in his firm, but also what's going on in other firms. Whenever we because we typically don't have microscopic control of which firms are on which core in which on the cloud. Our models actually slow down on the cloud. I mean, they get much slower because all these kind of machine-to-machine communications tend to be much slower than the intra-machine communication. So unless there's some kind of exotic cloud with very fast interconnects, we're not able to make the cloud work.
No, I'm talking just one giant machine, 400 CPUs, 12 terabyte of memory. You can get that.
Okay, fair enough. And we've actually run this thing with a 20,000 on the 20,000 core Bridges machine in Pittsburgh. And I say, as of right now, I mean, the way our code works is we're able to get about 100 to 1 speed up with 96 cores. When I go to 20,000 cores, I'm only getting like maybe 200 to 1 speed up. So we still have some serial bottlenecks in the code that are prohibiting us from getting up to the full parallelization that we hope to be able to get from there. Obviously, this is a very, very decentralized model. It should be able to speed up, proportion how many agents there are, but so at the moment there are some bottlenecks.
Yeah, I'm curious, like running that for global models, because how you calibrate this for smaller countries and also like export, import, trading, all that taken account of, should be the simulation be very different, or? Yeah,
so a couple different ways to answer the question. One is, when I first started working on this model, someone suggested that instead of working on the U.S., we should go to like a small country, Scandinavian country, maybe like one of the Baltics, Latvia, Lithuania. What we found out was that in those countries, even though they have pretty good data, in some ways they even have better data than the U.S. In other ways, the data were not really as suitable, and so that's the key to building a model of this type is you have to have a bunch of data. And so you want to just be sure that you have, you're going to have data on the entire kind of industrial sector and the industrial, the whole, the whole set of firms, the whole private sector. And lacking that, you're going to basically get stuck somewhere. So I think that today you probably could do, from what I know about the data, you could probably do some Scandinavian countries and maybe the Baltics. But for example, you definitely have, at this point today, only the Bank of England can do England because, or can do the UK because they have the data. The data are not generally available. For France, Germany, those kind of countries, the data are not readily available. Even in Japan, you typically have to buy the data, or there's some barriers to getting all the data. And then as soon as you get outside of the developed world, the data are just really crappy. So the data fall off very precipitously on this. Even if you say, you'd hope that that the tax data would be sufficient, but it turns out that most countries still don't have all the tax data in easily usable form. Or they may have a year or two of tax data, but what they don't have is the great thing about the U.S. is that we have data. The tax data go back to 1976, so we really have almost 50 years of tax data, and that's been the key. Now on the trade thing, some of you will know that there is in fact a very famous or very kind of is a new emerging standard in trade theory called and I'm not kidding you about this. And if those of you have not heard this before, this is not a joke. The current state of the art in trade theory is called the new trade theory, two news, because it was Krugman who made the new trade theory, and now it's Melitz and these guys who made the new trade theory. Anyways, the cool thing about it is that it is in fact it's actually microscopically based in the sense that it's based on on firm level. It's which firms trade with what countries, et cetera. So it's basically firm based, and there are good data about that. The trouble is, it really it postulates simply by assumption that it is the most productive firms who are the exporters. And what I've shown you here on these data are once a firm gets very sizable, it's actually not among the most productive anymore. So I've been talking to those guys to some extent, and some of their basic specifications are wrong for being kind of too simplistic, too homogeneous. So I think that there is work to be done with this kind of model when it comes to doing trade theory. And then a whole other question, maybe that's probably your question, was kind of how to integrate trade theory into my current model. And the short answer is I don't know how to do that yet. But we have been talking to the new trade theorists as to how to get trade into how to get kind of our microscopic model into their models. See, their models are essentially continuum of firms. They say there's a continuum of firms, and those firms export, and basically if your productivity is below a certain threshold, you can't export. So they have a kind of a mathematical but simplistic way to represent trade.
So talking about the data, how available is such data? I mean, is this like a privacy issue of availability, or is it only for nonprofits? Because this kind of data combined with like exactly where they are and
right.
a bunch of other information, we should be able to make a much more comprehensive model.
Fair enough, Greg. So I think on the data availability, first of all, census publishes. So basically, every 5 years, the census does what's called an economic census. I mean, you guys know about the decadal census on population, but every 5 years, census does an economic census. With that economic census, they do a pretty deep dive into many of the categories I've shown here. Not all of them. For example, they don't do productivity, for example, but they do a whole bunch of categories. So you can certainly get a lot of detailed information in the summary form that I've shown here. If you want to get the data on touch individual tax records, you have to go sit at census. But then if in fact you say you're going to use the individual tax record data, if you're going to use individual record data, that's a disclosure problem, and they're not going to let you use data on individual firms. Now, there are various moves afoot to produce either synthetic data, that is data that have exactly the same characteristics as the real data but are just not suitably anonymized, or to produce other ways to query the data where it doesn't reveal privacy problems. But my sense is that we are still several years away, potentially many years away, from having in essence what would be kind of like public use data sets that are kind of that don't have any privacy or disclosure issues. And just to give a sense of it, by the way, is that when I do ask census to run some custom thing for me, like I had them run this productivity thing for me as what's called a custom tabulation. If in fact like one of my bins down here ends up with too few firms in it, they have a disclosure problem, my choice is either to junk the whole analysis because I can't use any of it because they don't want me to use data with a disclosure problem, or I have to pay their attorney, say like $5,000 or $10,000 in order for them to determine whether or not it actually poses a problem or not. So in general, I mean, I think that as soon as you get down to looking at individual firms, the current view of these data at census, the tax data, the IRS data at census is that you cannot use data on individual firms. Period. You can't report data on actual individual companies. It's just,
and that should be fine. What I really have in mind is more like, so like we have, this is like in our team, but like Alphabet owns this, license to everybody's change of address forms. So
okay,
now we know where these people are. If we can understand where they work, really what we want is the graph, right? A falsified graph into all these agents. Hopefully every node is big enough. And then one limitation of your current work is that you have aggregates across all industries, all locations. If you start collecting this graph that's much more granular, presumably your model to explain it is going to have to account for these phenomena. And then the resulting model, it sounds like it would be fairly actionable in terms of policy.
Could very well be. And I guess, particularly if you guys have the rights to the data, then of course, then you're in a different situation than the rest of us researchers.
Oh no, we can like this. We bought this stuff.
Fair enough.
Internal stuff is very secret, but this is like Infotor. This companies that sell this.
You got it. Yeah. So I think what you described seems eminently doable, Greg. I think, and probably would have significant value. I would say, in particular, kind of right, the matching individuals to companies. Or and locations and establishments. I mean, it turns out, just as a footnote, let me mention, the census actually invests a lot of time to try to match. Even like they'll say here's an establishment being a location of an operation. Who is the corporate parent, and has that changed hands over the last year? Has one location been sold to another firm in a similar business or something? They actually have to spend a lot of time to get that right. So it might even be the kind of thing where you guys might have access to data which actually would be of use to census. In which case, who knows? Maybe you guys can cut some deals to help them do their job better. Because I think that I have a couple of students who sit now at census, and they just report that there's quite complicated data issues associated even with. I mean, I can be more precise, but here's one example. Let me just give an example on this growth rate stuff. Growth rate from year to year of a firm is actually quite hard to figure out because individual establishments may have changed hands. Growth rate of establishments, which is locations, is easy, but growth rates of firms is hard. So even today, census is not reporting growth rates of firms. So that's an example where having the locational data, would be important. And so there may be ways that from a big data point of view, you guys could even contribute to helping the whole data stream move forward from what is possible today.
So I'm actually surprised. So we were going to buy it. I'm thinking Equifax for small firms, Dun & Bradstreet for large firms, and CoStar for location to firm.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
But just it seems like they're actually doing quite a good job.
Fair enough. And I just think now you guys probably know different than I do, but typically when I'm going to access a credit report, typically it's going to be like $1 to $5 per ping. And so if I got 6 million firms, you're talking about a big budget to whack that whole data set. But you guys may have a quantity discount on that somehow. So
it would have to be that, and or collaboration. We're making a larger product. So maybe one more question about this. A lot of this data seems like refines corporate valuation theory significantly. So usually it's you use betas and that kind of stuff, or maybe more sophisticated version of that, but it's very simplistic compared to the analysis you're doing here. In terms of firm growth, it seems like you can capture correlations between them that are way more complicated than classic finance theory.
Yeah.
Have you thought about improving finance theory or investment based on this data?
Yes. Have we thought about it? Yes. Have we done anything? No. So basically, I guess our main goal is to get this book out. And then the book is going to, we imagine the book is going to be useful, but both inside normal economics and inside traditional, what's called industrial organization within economics. But we have fielded some queries from the Wall Street guys who say look, we want to do valuation of a company, right? So we want to know things like, if we slice and dice the data by, growth rate, by size, by age, by this, that, and the other, can we do things? Now, let me just also mention one thing we've not discussed, Greg, is that it's a very interesting aspect of these tax data that Congress is basically. I'm going to paint with a coarse brush here and say Congress has put limitations on what can be done with these tax data. Mm-hmm. One of them is many of the financial variables cannot be exposed to researchers. So things like individual firm profits, that kind of stuff, individual firm depreciation, right? It's things that you might think of as the crown jewel of the firms. So it turns out what I can do though is the census does do gross tabulation of these things by age, size, et cetera, productivity. But I can't go in and get certain things out of there just by actual congressional fiat. They determine that those are too sensitive. Now it may be that we could certainly build better models if we could do if we had access to those data, and then I think then the finance guys would be super interested. But as of right now, many of those kind of intra-firm financial things are just off limits for what we do.
Cool.
One more question, if you don't mind.
Yes.
So, what is the primary utility of this kind of research? So I can imagine that if you had some variables that are the results of a policy, then you can tune those variables and recommend the policy. But you don't have those policy variables, right?
Yeah. In this model, there are not many of them. It turns out there eventually are some in the extended chapters, but there are not very many. It's fair to say.
So what is the primary purpose of building this model?
Well, so I got like 3 different answers for you. Let me just run through a couple of them for you. So if you guys are you guys familiar with the term from the natural sciences called ab initio? That is the idea of I want to figure out what the properties of some system are just from its components. So I want to do some ab initio calculation, like what are the properties of the water molecule from just looking at the hydrogen atom and oxygen atom. So in some sense, what we're doing here is we're doing ab initio calculation of the U.S. economy, of the private sector. We're saying, starting out only from its components, can we grow, in essence, the overall thing, right? So that has just scientific value, right? This is in some sense, this is not unlike Newton trying to figure out why this solar system has the structure it does, right? There's these hidden things called acceleration and velocity or whatever, right? So what we're saying, you can go very far explaining the structure by looking at these job-to-job transition flows, et cetera. So the one thing is just a scientific challenge. But I think an important thing, as you say, though, is that when we want to get to the next step of this, going to macro, then in fact we imagine 10 years from now, and every country can do this for their own economy. Then you hook up the consumers into it, hook up the central banker into it. You can now have every central bank can have a coherent model of its own economy with the levers hooked in there now, with the policy levers hooked in there, right? So we've not done that so far, but I think that's obviously the next step. But then think about it further: is that imagine that you have now 200 central bankers, all with their own model of their economy, all agent-based. There's no reason why you couldn't glue all those things together, right? And then you have a model at kind of like a global scale, and that could have giant implications, for I think imagine just kind of alleviating world hunger or alleviating or enhancing the standard of living across. So anyway, I think that my sense is that this is not the last word on this kind of model. This what I've shown you guys today is kind of the first word, or the first step to building high fidelity models at full scale. And from here on out, now it's you're only limited by your imagination as to what you want to do with these things.
I see. Okay. So basically, the initial part is that here's the minimal model, like with 10 parameters that actually reproduce what we see, and then we can enhance it and parameterize it more if we want.
Exactly. Let me just mention one other angle on it too. Is that so? A couple of years ago, just before COVID, we had there was a conference in China at Sun Yat-sen University, so down in Guangzhou, where they have the world's biggest supercomputer, or at the time it's the Tianhe machine, like the Milky Way machine that's down there. And so they actually have an active research program on trying to build this kind of model for Guangzhou, which is I think it's something like it's 100 million people, I want to say, 100 million people, and 40 million workers, and 2 million firms, something like that. I don't remember the details. But so they have an active research program where they want to basically deploy this kind of model. They had a prototype up and running, although very, very, very crude. But at that meeting, there was a guy from I want to say MPTI in Moscow, Moscow Physical Tech, and he showed us results without showing us the guts. He showed us results from what he said was a 137 million model of the Russian economy. Once again, I don't know how good the data are for Russia. My senses are that they probably are not very good. But the main thing to say is that this idea is in the wind right now. The idea of kind of let's abstract from the representative agent model of conventional economics has to go, and now we have all this data. Let's start building models that are grounded in the data. So that's very much in the air, both within the multi-agent systems, kind of agent-based modeling community, but it's also in the air, internationally among computationally capable economists.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks. It was fantastic.